Hello everyone, welcome to Global Compliance live webinar on Excel spreadsheets and FDA device regulations. My name is Ron and I'm going to be a host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance team, I'd like to say thank you for being part of this event. Now, today's webinar would be presented by Dan O'Leary. A few words about Dan before we could start off this session. He is the president of Ombu Enterprises LLC, a company offering training and execution in operational excellence, focused on analytic skills and a systems approach to operations management. Dan has more than 30 years experience in quality, operations, and program management in regulated industries including aviation, defense, medical devices, and clinical labs. He has a master's degree in mathematics, is an ASQ certified biomedical auditor, quality auditor, quality engineer, reliability engineer, and Six Sigma Black Belt, and is certified by APICS in resource management. We are honored to have such a distinguished person such as Dan with us to present the webinar for today. Now, before we begin, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to inform you of the program outline for this training session. Now, this webinar is for 75 minutes duration. Now, first, Dan will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that would be covered, and he would then share with you his presentation. And we'd also like to inform all participants one part of the teleconference has been placed on mute and would remain so until the Q&A begins towards the end of the webinar. Now, this is for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity and for allowing the presenter to speak clearly so that everyone present can take maximum benefit from this webinar. And ladies and gentlemen, also request you all to hold back your questions until the Q&A begins. 10 minutes of your time will be allotted to the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered by Dan. Now, if for any reason you get logged out of this training session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. And now that we're all ready to start, I request Dan to take it from here. Dan?
Well, thank you, Ron, and welcome everybody to our discussion today about Excel spreadsheets and FDA device regulations. Now, when I get into the slide, you'll see that there is a slide number at the bottom of each slide. So if you have a question about a particular slide, note the slide number and we can go back and look at it in context. So here's the outline of the things that we're going to look at today. First, I'm going to give you an overview of the FDA regulations. Now, these are the regulations for medical devices, and so we'll look at what the regulatory requirements are. And then we'll look at some issues involving validation of Excel. Now, the requirements are going to be to validate the spreadsheet, so we'll talk about how to do that in Excel. And then we're going to look at a bunch of things that are in Excel that will help you make your Excel spreadsheets more efficient and actually aid in their correct calculations, which is what the issue is in validation. So we're going to look at the convert function, and that's very, very important function. We're going to look at formula auditing. This is a way to tell whether or not the spreadsheets are operating correctly by being able to trace where values are coming from and where they're going to. So it's a very important technique. We'll talk about protection. In a validated spreadsheet, you want to make sure that the user cannot change particular cells or anything like that. So consequently, you need to protect the worksheet. So we'll discuss those issues. Now we're going to look at something called track changes. And this is built into Excel, but unfortunately it is not as powerful as we would like in order to solve some other regulatory problems. But it's got a very good application in spreadsheet validation. So we'll see how to use that as a tool. Then we're going to discuss this problem in the regulations about automated processes. We'll look at electronic records, which are in Part 11 of the FDA regulations, and some of the issues associated with what Excel spreadsheets, summary and conclusion, and then we'll open it up for questions. All right, so let's get started here. So we're interested in the regulations. So we want to talk about the automated processes for production or the quality system. So that's what the requirement is in the regulation. Now, we're not looking at the purchase of a major software system. The same rules apply, but we want to focus on Excel spreadsheets. And usually what happens is this is what I tend to call a homegrown application. People understand Excel spreadsheets. They do a lot of work in them. So you have a skilled employee who builds an application in Excel. So the way to think about this is analogous to writing a quality system procedure or a work instruction. Now, you don't always get these Excel spreadsheets from people inside the company. Maybe you contract out the work, but that doesn't make any difference to the FDA. You still own the responsibility for the Excel spreadsheet. So consequently, even if you contract it out, you've got to make sure that all of the things that we're going to talk about have been addressed. And so that's going to be very important as we look at some of the issues that come up, because we're going to end up writing reports and protocols, and even if you contract it out, you as the medical device manufacturer have to review and approve them. Now, we're going to look at two simple examples. It's easier to get down into some examples to show what's going to happen. So in our first case, we're making some kind of chemical mixture. Now, I ran across this problem in an IVD company, but it's not specific to IVDs. But we want to mix some things together. And there's a recipe written in an SOP, and it has a variable quantity. It depends upon the production volume. So we don't make the same amount every time. It's got a shelf life, for example, so we're going to make as much as we use. The operator calculates all of the things that go into this mixture by hand using a calculator. And there's a potential problem there, because we don't leave a nice record behind. If the operator made a mistake, we're not going to see it. If the operator misapplied the formula, we're not going to know it. And so manufacturing engineer says, you know, this is a good opportunity for preventive action. I'm going to automate the calculation using an Excel spreadsheet. So that's the production example we're going to talk about. Now, another thing that we might be interested in is utilizing the spreadsheet as part of the corrective action system statistical analysis. And this information is going to end up going to management review. So the important point here is that because we are preparing stuff for management review, it's part of the quality management system. And what we're going to find is it gets, as a result, covered in the regulation. Now, here is the regulation. What it says, it's 820.70I. It's under production. It's under production and process controls, but it actually is a little bit more extensive than that. And so when it says that computers or data processing systems are used as part of either production or the quality system, and so this is where we're not always in the production side, you need to validate the software for its intended use according to an established protocol. Now, what this means is basically you're going to write a set of test plans. That's going to be the protocol. So we're going to talk about what goes into these test plans. And then all software changes have to be validated before they're approved and issued. Right? So you're going to validate the software. You're going to put it out on the floor. You're going to use it in production of the quality system. And then you might decide that it needs to change. And so you're going to go back through and approve the changes before you reissue them. So in essence, you're going to do the same steps all over again. And then you're going to document everything. So this is a regulated industry, so if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. That's the easy way to think about it. Now, we've got a similar situation in ISO 13485. Now, this is not FDA, but on the other hand, many companies have a system that has both ISO 13485 and FDA QSR. So it's interesting to see how they line up. And they don't exactly, because here, it's a lot of the same concepts, except that it's production and service provision, and that affects the ability of the product to conform to specified requirements. So what's different here is that FDA QSR discusses issues involving the quality system. 1345 is only production. So 1345 is a little bit narrower than FDA QSR. If you follow everything in FDA QSR, you will automatically pick up everything in 1345, but not the other way around. Now, we're going to look at these FDA requirements by breaking them down into some of their pieces. So first of all, we're interested in the applications. We're talking about computers. We don't say automated data processing systems anymore. Remember, FDA QSR was written in the late 90s, and that was a term at the time. So we're interested in computers that are used in production or computers that are used in the quality system. And the requirement is that we have to validate this software for its intended use according to an established protocol. In other words, three things. So we're going to do validation activity based upon the intended use. The implicit assumption here is that we're going to have a statement of the intended use. We're going to know exactly what it is. And that's going to help us develop the protocol. And the protocol, as I said, is basically the tests that we're going to conduct. Now, who does this? It's the manufacturer. Now, you might contract it out, but that is irrelevant to the FDA. If it's being used in your production or quality system, you have the responsibility for it. And so even if you contract it out, you fully own it. It's your responsibility to make sure that everything is done correctly. Oh, and by the way, if you contract it out, you've just found yourself under purchasing controls. Now, you're going to keep records. So the validation activities and all of their results are going to be documented. And then it's going to go under change control. And so you need to make sure that all of these Excel spreadsheets all throughout your company are known, that they are identified in some way, that they are under change control. You can go find them, and you can know what version there are in use, because if there are any changes, you have to take them back through the validation cycle. Now, let's look at this process flow diagram. There's an FDA guidance document on software validation, and it's got a section on production software and quality system software as opposed to the software that goes into a medical device. And this is a sort of a high-level picture of what they're talking about. So what we need to do is recognize the potential use of a computer. And we're going to talk about that when we get to the end, when we look at audit programs. And then we're going to establish the intended use. We're going to write a validation protocol. We're going to conduct the validation. And then we're going to prepare a report. And the protocol and the report are going to be quality records. And I'll tell you a good way to approach this to reduce some of the work involved. Now, the middle of this, and perhaps the whole thing, is typically defined in a quality system procedure. So you might have a quality system procedure that tells you how to do software validation in general, or it might be more explicit for Excel spreadsheets because there are some particular issues. And then for any given intended use, you're going to write the protocol that tells you how you validated the specific Excel spreadsheet for that intended use. Now, I'd mentioned some guidance documents, and so it's interesting to note that the quality system regulation first appeared in the Federal Register on October 7th, 1996. So it's been around for a long time. There have not been any major changes to it until this year when the Unique Device Identification Rule was issued. So that's going to be a major change. But other than that, other than some technical changes, it's the same as it was in 1996. Now, in December 1996, FDA issued something called the Quality Systems Manual. This is really, really good because the idea here is that this book, and it's available on the FDA website. You can plug this title in to the search engine, and you'll get to it. This book is, I don't know, about 18 chapters, anywhere from 20 to 60 pages. that explain how to implement the quality system regulation. And Chapter 7 discusses the validation requirements for computers in production or the quality system. So it's very, very important, very, very valuable. Now, it's a little dated. Things have changed since 1996, but the concepts haven't changed, so it's really good. In 2002, January of 2002, FDA issued a guidance document on principles of software validation, and Section 6 discusses this explicitly. Computers used in production of the quality system. So there are two documents you can download at no charge from the FDA website that are going to be very, very valuable in getting your quality system and production software validated. Now, here's a big issue. Computers today are so prevalent in the work environment that we don't even think about them anymore. You know, back in 1996, they were relatively rare. You didn't find a computer on everybody's desk. Today, pretty much you do. So because they are around, you need to be really vigilant to recognize when somebody is using a computer involving the production or quality system because you've invoked this regulatory requirement. Now, our two examples, the production chemical mix and the tracking, is a conversion from a paper program to an automated system. And that's what we're going to see in the typical kind of application is that these Excel spreadsheets get introduced for the first time because somebody is removing a paper-based system and putting in place some kind of automated system. And what people don't often recognize is that they are invoking this regulatory requirement. So I have a couple of recommendations. During review and approval of documents, look for new or revised computer applications. If a document, like a work instruction or a quality system procedure, mentions that something is done on a computer, then you should be making sure that there is that computer is validated and it's all documented with a protocol and report. Train your internal quality auditors to look for new or revised computer applications. So when they're out doing quality audits, they should be asking the question, what is the status of this computer software that I see somebody using as I'm conducting the audit? Right? So is it validated? And so that should give them an audit trail, and they should be tracking in the audit. They should be following that thread to make sure that computer software application is validated. Now, is a spreadsheet an electronic record? Well, that issue arises in Part 11. And electronic record means any combination of all of this stuff, which I'm not going to read to you. There's a guidance document about Part 11 that says that FDA considers Part 11 applicable to records that are required to be maintained under predicate rules. In other words, those are rules that are not Part 11 itself. If they are maintained in electronic format in addition to paper format, and they're required and they're relied upon to perform regulated activities, then they're going to fall into Part 11. So you need to be careful. It is as much a question of the use as it is whether or not you store the results on paper. And FDA investigators know this, and they're going to check. All right, so now we're going to establish the intended use. The software guidance document lays out an approach and how to do this, and we're going to follow that. So the first thing is to define the intended use. And this means having a nice clear-cut statement, because the next thing that you want to do is understand, particularly with device production, how much the device production aspects depend upon the software functioning properly. And that's going to lead you to risk management. Now, the extent to which you do all of the validation, how much testing you do, and so on, is really going to be based upon what are you doing with the software and what is the risk that you will ship devices that are not safe and effective as a result of a problem with the software. So that's what you're really trying to get at. You need to define the operating environment. Where does this thing operate physically? What kind of space is it in? Where does it operate electronically? Is it connected to a network? What version of the operating system is in place? What version of the software is in place? If you validated some stuff in 2003, is that validation still good if you're now running the software in a 2007, Excel 2007 or 2010 environment? So then you're going to document requirements for performance. How well does it handle errors, security? Are there any safety functions, and so on? And you're going to define the acceptable performance stated as objective criteria. And this is going to form the basis of the tests that you're going to do in the protocol. You're going to define in the protocol the objective criteria based upon how this software is supposed to perform, which is derived from its intended use. So all of this is going to fit together. Now, here's our examples, very simple. So the production mixing example, we're going to perform calculations for a chemical mix buffer incorporated into an in vitro diagnostic reagent. That's our intended use. Dependence on device production, well, incorrect calculations could lead to an improper mix. An improper mix could impact the way the reagent operates, and so we might have a problem. We might misdiagnose a patient, for example. And so I'm going to call this risk medium. Now, I haven't given you how to define risks, but there's a lot of medical device risk management stuff out there. So however your 14971 system works, maybe that's a way to help you define risks. Now, the nonconforming material disposition, I'm going to track disposition of nonconforming material for management review. Device production is not impacted by the software. So this is up in the quality system. It's not production software. So if it doesn't work correctly, I'm still going to, it's not going to affect the devices that I manufacture. So I'm going to call this risk low. Now, I'm going to write a protocol, and I'm going to write some test cases that demonstrate the correct answer. I'm going to figure out what the correct answer is in advance, so I'm going to know before I run the test where it's going to show up in the workbook. Right? So I know the correct answer is supposed to be in a certain cell, and what I'm going to say is when I put the following inputs in, this is the answer that appears in cell B4, for example. So, so I'm going to define all of this in advance. Then I'm going to write some test cases that show what happens when I put in incorrect data. And I want to plan what could go wrong and how the workbook is going to handle this error. And we'll see some examples. So we're going to develop these test cases. We're going to use the tools we're going to discuss. And one of the things we're going to look at is formula auditing, because in the report, I want to collect screenshots. I want to demonstrate that the data is moving from one cell to the other cell the way I anticipate it. And formula auditing is going to give me that tool. It's really powerful. It's really well worth understanding. Then I'm going to run the protocol. I'm going to run every test case. The positive test cases are where I put in correct data and I get out correct data. The negative test cases are where I put in incorrect data and check the error handling. I'm going to compare the actual results with what I expect, make sure that they line up, and when they don't line up, I've got a problem to fix. I'm going to take screenshots for documentation, and I'm going to turn on track changes, which I'll explain how to do. And it's going to create a change log. So I want to put that in my report as well that shows the objective evidence that I operated the test case the way I expected it to. Now I'm going to prepare a report. It's going to have all of the test cases, positive and negative, produce the expected results. I'm going to illustrate the report with screenshots. I'm going to put printed output into the report, and I'm going to include the change log as an appendix to the report. So I'm going to have a complete documentation package of what I did to demonstrate that this software is going to work the way I expect it to. All right, so sorry, I had to cough. So now we're going to look at Excel data validation. This is really, really important, particularly for trapping errors. So typically, you're going to ask the user to enter data for desired calculations and results, and so getting the right data in is really important. And you can restrict the data that goes in. You can restrict it so it's a certain range of dates, for example. You have to take things down from a list, and this is really, really good if you want to sort and search because it makes sure that everything is spelled correctly. You could say, for example, that in a certain cell you're only allowed to put in positive whole numbers. You can also create your own error messages and help messages, and so that's really useful to get the user to operate the software correctly. All right, so here's an example. What we're going to do is show you how to do data validation. And in this case, I want cell B4, so I'm going to pick cell B4, to be a whole number between 0 and 10. So in other words, if somebody tries to type in the number 11, they're going to get an error. If they try to type in the number 5.5, they're going to get an error because I'm restricting the entries. So how do I do this? Well, I select cell B4, choose data validation, select the settings tab. Now I'm doing all of this in Microsoft Excel 2003. Things moved around in 2007 and 2010, but the same drop-down boxes and all of that's going to show up. It's just going to be in a slightly different place than my example here. I'm going to select a whole number from the allow list. So what this means is that up here I've got, let's see, up here I've got this allow, and I've got a drop-down box here, and I've got a bunch of choices. So I picked whole number, and then I want the data to be between 0 and 10. All right, so I'm going to enter all of this stuff in. Click OK. Now I'm going to put in some test values. If I put a 5 into cell B4, it's going to take it. It's exactly what we want. Now I'm going to try putting a 15 into cell B4, and I'm going to get an error message. Right, and what it says here is the value you entered is not valid. User has restricted the values. This is the default error message that Excel is going to produce. If I click on retry, I can put a new value in. If I click on cancel, whatever value was in that cell gets restored, so it doesn't change. Now this is really valuable because what I've done is I've kept somebody from putting incorrect data into a data entry cell. Now, I could have a more explicit error message that I'm going to write. Maybe I don't want the default error message from Excel. So I'm going to go put the cursor in cell B4, choose data validation, and now I'm on the error alert tab. And what you see is that it's going to stop me. I've got some other choices there. And it's going to produce a message that's got a title that I've just entered, invalid data, and the error message. You must enter a whole number between 0 and 10 in this cell. Now, this is really useful because the default message just says, oh, you put in wrong data. This error message actually tells you why it was a mistake. Right? So you're writing this in order to help the user understand how to do the spreadsheet. Now, we go back and do the same thing again, only now this is the error message that pops up. You must enter a whole number between 0 and 10 in this cell. Right? So notice invalid data entered. I created that. You must enter a whole number between 0 and 10 in the cell. I created that. So this is my tailored error message, and you can tailor the error messages cell by cell. So this is really important. And then the retry and cancel work exactly the same way as I explained earlier. Now, sometimes it's valuable to guide the user as to what the data is before they try to put something in and then get an error message. So you can actually create the so-called input message. And what happens in the input message is that you give it a little title and you give it a message, and when somebody puts the cursor in that cell, this message is going to pop up telling them what they have to do, right? And as opposed to the error message that doesn't pop up until after they do something wrong. So this is really valuable because it can save a lot of time and frustration. And here the message is the same. The cell must be a whole number between 0 and 10. So let's see how this works. Now, as I said, all my examples come out of the 2003 version of Microsoft Excel, but all of this stuff works exactly the same way in the later versions. So in cell B4, I have the number 5. I put the cursor there, and lo and behold, I get my input message, right? Allowed data, this cell must be a whole number between 0 and 10. The user now knows what kind of data has to go into that cell because I've restricted the data, and I've given the user a message to inform them. Now, I showed you the drop-down list. So here's what's on the drop-down list. I can have any value, which is the default until you set something different. A whole number, a decimal, a list, a date, a time, text, and you can even create your own using formulas. And so we're going to look at a couple more examples to see how this might work. So now we're going to go to the spreadsheet to track the disposition of non-conforming material. And I've got a whole bunch of column headings. And I've told you what they are. And I only have a certain set of dispositions that I want to allow people to use. And I want to restrict the entries because I want to be able to count and classify the number of times I use these different dispositions. And so I don't want people to pick different things. So for me, return to vendor is RTV. Maybe somebody else is going to say return to supplier and type in RTS. I don't want to allow that to happen because when I go to count and classify, I've got to find all of the stuff that's happened. Maybe somebody is thinking they're typing in the word rework, but they leave out the W. Now when I go to count and classify, I'm not going to find the word rework because it's not spelled correctly. I can prevent all of that stuff from going on with using the list function in data validation. So here's how it's going to happen. Over here on the right side, I've got my list of dispositions, and I've actually put the colors in because it helps me later figure out what's data and what is these lists that I'm operating with. So I'm putting all the column headings, and then I'm going to list all the possible dispositions. This is how I'm going to set it up. We want to restrict entries to the list of dispositions. So I'm going to collect column E, right? Not just individual cells. I can set this up for the whole column, right? So I'm going to pick column E up at the top, choose data validation, go to the settings tab, all of the stuff we looked at before. Select list from the allow list, right? So this is where I'm at. And over here, I am going to enter where the list is located, right? And so that's easy to do. If I hit this button, then I can go just highlight the list, and Excel will take care of it for me automatically. I'm also going to put in an input message in this case, so use dispositions from the drop-down list. So it's going to be very valuable to make it easy to use. Now, here's what's going to happen. I go to cell E5 as an example, and when I put the cursor there, the first thing that happens is I get my message, right? So this is telling the user they're going to have to use the dispositions from the drop-down list. And look, there's a little arrow button that pops up. If I click on that, I'll get the list, right? And that's the only thing that's going to be allowed to go into that cell. Well, I did, and there's the list, right? So I'm going to click on the arrow next to the cell. The list is going to show. I'm going to pick the entry that I want, hit return, and that's the entry that's going to go into that cell. And those are the only entries that I'm allowed to put in that cell. That are the entries off this drop-down list. And it's the same drop-down list I developed over here on the side. Now, I can also do custom stuff. So any place where that I have a formula, I can utilize that formula to go figure out what's going on. So we want to make sure all the entries in a particular column are a number. I don't want to put in text or a date. Right? Maybe this is the number of items that I disposition. So I want the number 3. I don't want somebody to type in THREE. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to choose column C, choose data validation, and there's a formula called isNumber. It returns true if the entry in the cell is a number. And so that's what I'm going to put in, and it's going to work in all the same ways that I just talked about. So this is going to be very, very valuable in controlling inputs. You can make sure that only legitimate inputs go into the Excel spreadsheet, and that's going to be really important. Now, we're going to look at this convert function. This is built into Excel, but you might have to turn it on. Now, what's really important here is that if you are converting from one unit of measurement to another unit of measurement, you want to do it consistently. And what I often find is that somebody might go to a book to find out a conversion factor, and they'll type it in and they'll do the math that way. And if I'm doing something that is analogous and I happen to go to a different book, I might get a different conversion factor. It might be off by in the second or third decimal place. I don't want to let that stuff happen. So it turns out that Excel has a built-in conversion function. It's really powerful. Now, if it's not available, if you try to use convert and you get an error message, you have to go to the analysis tool pack and load it in, and you can find it in help. So it's really easy. You load it in, and the convert function will be available to you. So here's an example of how it works. If I want to convert 4 fluid ounces to milliliters, all right, this is how I would do it. I would enter convert. Here's the 4. I'm working on fluid ounces, so its abbreviation is OZ, and notice it's in double quotes. And I'm converting it to milliliters. Its abbreviation is ML, also in double quotes. Now, what typically happens is I put an entry into one cell, and I want the results to appear in another cell. So this is how I would do it. In the place where I want the results to show up in milliliters, I'm going to put the entry into cell B3 in ounces, and I'm going to, in whatever cell this formula is in, I'm going to display the corresponding result in milliliters. This will make all of your conversions run consistently. You won't have to worry about the conversion factors. They'll always be the same if you use this technique for all of your spreadsheets, all through your factory. So that's going to be really, really important. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that you have with convert and in terms of measurement systems. And so here's the list, and the help screen explains all the stuff that's going on here if you get into convert. But here's the list of measurement systems. And then you have different units of measure in the measurement system, and they oftentimes have prefixes associated with them. So you can put in a prefix. So if we're looking at a liquid measure, for example, the basic unit of liquid measure is the liter. But we saw an example with milliliters. So what we did was took L as the basic unit of measure, and we put an M in front of it, and that gave us ML, which is milliliters. And so we can build up any unit of measure that we want in the convert function. So this is really, really valuable. All right, so if you're converting units of measure, make sure you always use the convert function. Now we're going to look at formula auditing. And again, this is a really powerful technique because this is going to help you make sure that the spreadsheet operates the way you want. And it's going to show you how data moves around inside the workbook. So we need a couple definitions here. Precedent cells are cells that are referred to by a formula in another cell. Dependent cells are cells that refer to other cells. And I'll show you some examples here in a moment. So when you go to formula auditing, you get a little floating toolbar that pops up. It looks like this. It's got a bunch of stuff on it. that we're going to talk about, and a couple things that we're not going to talk about. But if I want to trace precedence, for example, then I'm going to hit this button on the floating toolbar. I put the cursor in a cell, hit trace precedence, and it is going to show me every cell that sends data into the cell where I put the cursor. And then, of course, I can take them all back out again. Now, I might ask a slightly different question. I put the cursor in a cell, and I want to know what cells use the data that's in that cell. So that's going to be dependence. Right? So I can trace dependence, I can remove the dependent arrows, and I've got a little function here that's going to remove all of the arrows. And then we're going to come back to the stuff on this other side in a bit. So here's my chemical mix example. All right, here's my recipe. And so what I'm interested in is, the way I typically set this up, I gray out the places that I do not want people to enter data. And I'll show you how I'm going to control that. But I'm going to gray those things out. And so everything that's grayed out, the user is not allowed to put data into. The white cells, the user is allowed to put data into, because I set it up that way. And I'll show you in a bit how that works. But this is my spreadsheet. I'm trying to make this chemical mix, and I want a final quantity of 18 liters. And so what it's going to do is tell me what I want in terms of milliliters, grams, and so on. And also I've converted these things here. And notice there's a problem you need to think about, and I've done this on purpose, is to show you the potential rounding problem. So you've got to make sure that things are rounded correctly, that you're showing the right number of significant digits. Now, down here is the floating toolbar that I talked about earlier, and I am tracing precedence and dependence. And so what I did was I put the cursor into cell D6, and I asked the question, what are the precedents? In other words, what cell feeds data into D6? And I got this blue arrow right here, right? So that tells me the data is moving from cell D3 into cell D6. Then I asked the corresponding question, what cells use the data in D6? And here is another blue line that shows that data moves from D6 into F6. So what's going on here is I can understand the relationship of cell D6 to all of the other cells that utilize its information, either putting stuff in or taking stuff out. And this is really, really important to make sure that your calculations are getting data from where you think they are. There's a nice graphic display. Now, the other thing that we can do is we can use the floating toolbar to find errors. Now, what I did was say I'm going to restrict values in certain columns, and I put the column headers in first, and then I restricted the values. Now I'm going to say, are there any invalid data in this spreadsheet? Is there anything that Excel recognizes as violating these rules? And so the floating toolbar, these are the things on the right-hand side, they're going to put a red circle around any cell that's got invalid data in it, right, based upon the data validation that I've done. So here we've got the word quantity and the word disposition. Neither one of them is the word disposition is not in the drop-down list. The word quantity is not a whole number, or is not a number at all, and so they're being circled as errors. And so Excel can help me find those kind of valid data as well. So this is really good. All right, now we need to talk about protecting the worksheet. Now, protection prevents users from making changes, and this is really, really important just in general stuff. I often, when I make a complicated spreadsheet that I'm going to use for myself, I protect it so that I don't inadvertently overwrite a complicated formula that I'm interested in. I just want to keep myself from making a mistake. If you are putting a validated spreadsheet out on the production floor or in the quality system, you definitely want to use protection with passwords, and so I'll explain how to do that. So protecting the worksheet has really got 2 steps, but I'm going to add one more. If I'm going to keep data from changing at all, I'm typically going to color that cell gray. And so I'm going to use a light gray, and that just tells me, and this is really helpful for the user, they're familiar with the concept that a cell is grayed out and you can't put data into it. So if it's gray, they don't try. That helps them manage and maneuver through the spreadsheet. But I have to do that. Excel isn't doing it automatically. The remaining cells, the ones that aren't shaded, are the ones where I am going to allow data entry. So for every cell, I'm going to unlock it, and I'll show you how to do that on the next slide. And then I'm going to protect the worksheet. Perhaps I'm going to use a password as well. And so what's going to happen is when I turn on protection, I can put data into the unlocked cells. The cells that are still locked, they prohibit entry into those cells. So this is how I set it up. The default is that all the cells are unlocked, the default is that all the cells are locked, and it has no effect until protection is turned on. And so if you go look, what's going to happen is that's going to be a check marks in this box. I want to unlock cell D3, the final volume that I want to create. So I'm going to put the cursor in cell D3, choose Format, Cells, select the Protection tab right here, uncheck Locked and Hidden. Right? The hidden is not usually checked, and so there's usually nothing to do, but just to be on the safe side. Right? So neither one of these 2 boxes is checked. Right? So I'm going to make sure that both of them are unchecked. Click on OK. Now, the second step is to turn on protection. So I'm going to go to Tools, Protection, protect the worksheet. In the dialog box, I'm going to check Protect Cells in the contents, select Lock Cells, select Unlock Cells, right? Because in these things, I want to be able to put the cursor into those cells. Even though I may not be able to put data into them, people find it very frustrating if they can't put the cursor into a cell that they want, even if they're not allowed to put data into it. They need to park the cursor someplace. Uncheck all of the other choices because you don't want people to be inserting rows and columns and hyperlinks and all of that stuff. If you want to use a password, enter it up here in the password box. Now, if you use passwords, you've got to keep them someplace safe because you will never get back into Excel to find out what the password is. And if you lose the password, you have to start all over again. You know, you've lost the spreadsheet. You can't make any changes to it. It'll still work. It's just that you can't make any changes to it if you need to update it. So keep all your passwords in a master list in a safe place so that you have access to them if you need to update or change the spreadsheet. But you don't want the users to get their hands on the password because you don't want unauthorized changes. So remember, these Excel spreadsheets are under change control. Now, try to enter data into a protected cell, and you get an error message. Right? It says here that the cell is protected, therefore it's read-only, and you're not allowed to make any changes. And then you can click OK. Now, we want to. So what this means is you're going to set up all of these formulas. You're going to decide which cells are going to do data entry, which cells are not going to do data entry. You're going to color them appropriately. You're going to restrict the data that goes into it with data validation. You're going to use convert in case you want to convert from one measurement system to another measurement system. And now you've got a nice, well-functioning spreadsheet. Now, one of the things we'd like to do is demonstrate that it actually works the way we'd like to by creating some objective evidence. Now, Excel is going to keep records of changes if you turn on Track Changes. And there's a long blurb here, but what's really important is that it'll only keep the changes for 30 days unless you change it to something other than finite number of days. It's going to keep a lot of data. So you got to be really careful, and that's going to lead us into a Part 11 discussion. But history is going to get deleted whenever you make some changes to the spreadsheet in the way you've got things set up. So it's not going to keep stuff permanently, but that's okay. For our purposes, we just want to keep a record during the validation exercise. So we're going to turn on track changes. And so we're going to go to Tools, Track Changes, Highlight Changes. We're going to get a dialog box that looks like this. Set it up the way I've shown you here. Then Excel is going to keep a record of the changes you make after you save them. And this is really, really important. If you don't save, Excel won't keep a record, because that's what triggers it to create the record. So if you make a change and don't save, you're going to lose the data. So in the chemical mix example, I'm going to illustrate how this works. We start with a total quantity of 20 liters. So let's change it to 12 liters and print the worksheet. Then change it to 15 liters, print the worksheet, and save. And we're going to look at what happens to the history. And notice in one case, I've got a save in there, and in the other case, I don't. All right, so now I want to review the history. So I'm going to set the dialog box up like this, and notice what I've got is I've got a list changes on a new sheet. And this is going to add a whole new sheet to the workbook. And here it is. Now, there's only one entry. And what's important here, it shows the old value of 20 and the new value of 15. Now, remember what I did. I started with 20. I changed it to 12. I printed out the worksheet because I'm thinking about keeping a record. And that's nice. But I didn't do a save. And then I changed the value to 15, did a save, printed out the worksheet. And track changes gave me the record, because I did a save in between, gave me the record that I moved from a value of 20 to a value of 15 in cell D3. Dan O'Leary did it, and it gives me the date and the time that it was done. And it tells me I changed the cell on sheet 1 in D3. It's going to give me a nice history. Now, the value here is that, as I said before, the history is going to go away after some period of time. But the value here is that this is going to give me a nice record to show how I executed the protocol. Right? I just got to remember to do all the saves in between. All right, so now we're going to talk about automated processes. Where do we do this stuff? All right, so an automated process is a production of quality system process that uses computers. And the regulation says I have to validate them for their intended use, and I have to validate all changes for their intended use. So we talked about intended use before. For automated processes, we need to define the intended use. This is Excel, so we need to define the intended use of the Excel spreadsheet. We're going to use this to build the content of the protocol. All right, that's going to help us understand what test cases we need. And the intended use is also going to lead us into this problem about risk management. Now, how do we do this? The validation protocol needs to include positive and negative test cases. And for every test case, I should know the planned inputs and the expected outputs. All right, so I'm going to define all of my test cases in advance, and my protocol is going to be the test cases that I'm going to run. Define them in advance. I know what the inputs are. I know what I should be getting for outputs. I know what cell they should be appearing in. And so what I'm going to do is put in this example, a positive case. 20 liters is the total volume. I've calculated the correct quantities for the chemicals that I use. And in the report, I'm going to take a screenshot showing the correct values, and I'm going to take a screenshot showing formula auditing. Now, this could be one screenshot. Depends on how cluttered you get with the little blue arrows. But what's really important here is that I know when I put in 20 liters what the output should be in all of the cells that I'm going to use. And so I'm going to check that they show me the correct values, that the data comes from the right place, I'm going to take a screenshot of that, and that's going to go into my report. And then I'm going to put in a negative case. Now, here's a good example. I never would make 200 liters of this material. It's huge. Too much material. This is a typo, right? The person intended to type in presumably 20, and instead they typed in 200 by mistake. I should have restricted the data input so that it's going to reject 200 liters as the total volume. And so what I want to do is then run a test case that says I'm going to put 200 liters in, and I should get an error message showing me that Excel detected 200 liters as an error, and I'm going to make a screenshot of that. And that's going to go into my report. And all through this, I've given you what the screenshots look like. So here we go. Positive test case, 20 liters as total volume. I've turned on formula auditing. You can see all the little blue lines. And so what I've done is said, well, when I put in 20 liters, what cells utilize that information? And so you can see there's a blue line with an arrowhead right here. There's an arrowhead here. There's an arrowhead here. There's an arrowhead here. And there's an arrowhead right here, because all of those cells use the information that's in D3. Now, this is going to be really valuable to demonstrate that the data is moving around inside the spreadsheet the way I expected it to. And I know what the value should be in all these cells because I calculated them in advance. So this is the screenshot that's going to go into my my report. Now, here's a negative test case. Right? I input 200 liters as the total volume. This is way too much. It's a typo. And I've restricted the data values here. And notice I've also created my own error message. Incorrect input value. The final quantity must be between 0 and 25 liters. Right? I put in 200 liters, and I got an error message. And so I'm going to take this screenshot. I'm going to put it in my report as well. Now, one of the questions is, how much do you need to validate? This is always a big question. There can be a fair amount of work in getting all of this right. So the level of effort needs to be commensurate with the risk of the automated operation. And this is what we get out of the guidance document that I mentioned earlier. So what are some of the risk factors? Well, how complex is the software? Now, typically Excel spreadsheets tend to be relatively simple and straightforward, but they can be very, very complicated as well. So you need to think about how this works. So how complex is this? How dependent is the automated process on this to produce a safe and effective device? Because that's what our final goal is. All of our devices that we ship need to be safe and effective. And we don't want any recalls. We don't want anybody to get hurt. We want to keep our risk low. So we're going to do some risk analysis, try to understand what's going on. So here's a couple of examples, and these come out of the guidance document. An automated milling machine might not require a lot of testing of its software because I've got a subsequent operation, some kind of inspection operation, where I fully verify against the specification before I release. So I have a low dependence on the software. If the software is done incorrectly, I'm going to find it, I would like to think, at this inspection step. And so I don't have to do a significant amount of validation. If, on the other hand, I have an automated controller and a sterilization cycle, if I've got automated test equipment for a life-sustaining or life-supporting device, then I really want to do a thorough job in validation because these tend to be higher risk situations. So exactly how much validation I need depends upon my risk analysis of the place of this software in making sure that the devices I ship are conforming and that they are safe and effective. Now, commercial software applications can be used as part of the quality system. And there's a couple of things that show up. A spreadsheet for quality system calculations, a statistical package like Minitab, graphics package, commercial databases for device history record. All of that stuff needs to be validated. So again, the extent of validation depends upon how much risk is associated with the device. Now, You're going to decide that, and you're going to build this Excel spreadsheet utilizing the tools and methods that I described earlier. And then you're going to create a documentation package. This is the objective evidence that you're going to leave behind. This is the objective evidence that is important to you because it shows that things work the way you expect them to work. Right? So you do not want to be making non-conforming material and incurring the costs. That's the reason to demonstrate that the software, Excel spreadsheet in this case, works correctly. The second reason is that you need the objective evidence to show an FDA investigator. But you should be doing this for your own sake, not just to satisfy the investigator. Now, what do I want to put in this package? Well, here's my list. Define user requirements. In other words, what do I need? What do I know about the user? Where it's going to happen? What are we looking for? What is the intended use? What validation protocol did I use? In other words, I'm probably going to write a validation protocol, run a couple of things, run some test cases, might find some mistakes, and so the protocol needs to be under some kind of version control when I actually use it. My acceptance criteria that I'm going to define in advance. Right, so I'm going to know what counts as good before I run any of this stuff. The test cases and their results, and then I'm going to write a summary. And the summary is basically going to be the statement that I did all of the work and the Excel spreadsheet passed its requirements and it's good to go. All right, now we're going to look at some warning letters. Now, here's what happens with warning letters. The FDA comes in and inspects device manufacturers, and if they find a problem, they'll write it up on what they call a Form 483, which is a record of inspectional observations. And the observations are what FDA calls nonconformances. So 483 is really a list of nonconformances, but it happens to be called observations. Then if they are serious violations of the regulations, then that company will end up getting a warning letter. And the warning letters are public information. They're available on the FDA website. And I've got a couple of examples to show what's going on here. Now, failure to adequately validate software. The software used in the sterilization chambers was not adequately validated in that unapproved sterilization cycle revisions could migrate from the server into the software in the sterilization chamber. Right? So the operator could download the incorrect version, and they weren't identified as being unapproved validation cycles. And so what this means is that the operator could make a mistake and actually run the wrong version of the program and not properly sterilize the load that's in the sterilization chamber. Here's another example: failure to validate software. Your firm did not validate the use of the Excel spreadsheet used to calculate the moisture vapor transmission rate in some test procedure. So they have a test procedure. They're probably entering data into the spreadsheet to show that, and they're doing some calculations behind the scenes in the spreadsheet to show that this test is working. So they're collecting data along the way. They need to validate that spreadsheet. They need to demonstrate that the spreadsheet is doing the calculations correctly. And the investigator came along and asked them for the validation protocol and report. They didn't have it. Here's a quality system example. No validation information or protocol were provided for the software that's used for product complaints, corrective actions, preventive actions, creating quality logs, and so on. So that was what showed up in the 483. The company responded. FDA comes back and says, your response is inadequate because a copy of the revised procedures and the validation protocols and reports were not provided. It is unclear how you plan to document quality system records. So what's going on here is that if FDA found that you didn't do something, like you didn't write procedures and reports, you didn't write protocols, and you didn't run them, your response has got to be, not only did we write the protocols and run them and validate the Excel spreadsheets, FDA wants copies of all of that stuff. They want the procedures. They want them all signed off. They want to see the signatures. They want to see the reports. They want a copy of the Excel spreadsheet. So if you don't do this up in advance and you find yourself in an inspection, you're actually going to do a lot more work in order to address the finding than if you'd done all of the stuff up front, and which is why I suggest that you incorporate Excel spreadsheet detection in both document review and quality system audits. Similar situation here, the corrective action analysis of nonconformances used at management review meetings is inadequate, and the report is computer generated on a non-validated software system. We reviewed your response. It's inadequate because you state you've eliminated the electronic records, but you've not provided evidence that you have an adequate record-keeping system to replace the electronic software. So here's a company that said, well, all right, we're not going to bother to validate it. We're just not going to do it that way anymore. So now FDA is coming back and saying, well, okay, that's fine. How do I know that the system you put in place is really going to work? And so, you know, they didn't get out of the problem by deciding to go down a slightly different path. All right, now we're going to look at Part 11. And we saw this slide before. This is what an electronic record says. And FDA considers that you fall under Part 11 if you are doing regulated activities using the software. So many people say, well, I'm not under Part 11 because I print out everything. Right? Okay, that's fine. So FDA is going to come in and they're going to watch you do your work. And if you haven't printed out everything, if you're using the software on the computer, then they're going to pull out this guidance document and they're going to expect that you have validated it. So what are the requirements in Part 11? Now, there's a long list of things here. I only want to focus on the bold, underlined stuff that's in the middle because this is where most people find that Part 11 trips them up. Use of secure computer-generated time-stamped audit trails that are going to record everything. Creation, modification, or deletion of electronic records. And so this comes back to the track changes feature in Excel. The track changes feature in Excel does not satisfy this requirement. So you cannot use Excel out of the box in order to satisfy Part 11. Notice we saw a couple of things. If you didn't save, it didn't create the record, and the record only lasts for a certain number of days. The default is 30 days. And so the end result is that you're not going to have time-stamped, independently recorded audit trails coming out of Excel the way that you buy Excel. Now, you can buy add-ins into Excel that will satisfy Part 11, but they're a separate piece of software that you've got to buy separately. So this gives us into this enforcement discretion. FDA will not enforce the Part 11 regulations for themselves. CDER is going to have a program where they're going to check Part 11 compliance during inspections. CDRH, the device people, typically aren't going to do that. They're going to rely upon 820.7DI, and if you've got that covered, they're not going to look into all of this other stuff in Part 11. So doing 820.7DI is really, really important. Now, summary and conclusions. It's really easy to make a mistake here. Automated processes in production and quality management systems must be validated for their intended use. There are Excel spreadsheets everywhere these days, so make sure you know where they all are, where you find them. Be vigilant in making process changes, in conducting internal audits. You need to know where all these Excel spreadsheets are because they have regulatory implications if you don't get them right. They've got to be validated before use, and here I've given you the system for validation. Excel has got a bunch of built-in tools, and we looked at those built-in tools that are going to help you make sure the data is correct and demonstrate that you've done the validation appropriately. We talked about Part 11, and the conclusion here is that the track changes function in Part 11 is not adequate. It doesn't leave the permanent audit trail that's required in Part 11. So you have to do something else. All right, so that concludes our presentation. I'm going to turn it back to our host, who is going to tell you how to ask questions.
Thank you, Dan, and for the wonderful presentation, and also the participants for cooperating with us. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is for the Q&A, and we request all who have questions for our presenter to click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon at the bottom of your participants panel. Now, this is to ask your questions verbally. You could also post your questions in the Q&A panel so that Dan can read it out loud and then answer it for you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if for any reason you're unable to ask your questions using either of two means that I just mentioned, please share it with me by chat and I can pass it on to our presenter to answer that for you.
Hi, this is Dan. I just lost the phone line, but I'm back.
Okay. Dan, we're just waiting for the questions from the participants' end. And meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that will just appear on your screen right now. Now, the feedback form has just 8 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and it would not take more than 2 minutes of your time to answer this. Now, this polling would remain till the end of the session, and you can answer it even after the Q&A is over. Ladies and gentlemen, the Q&A session has begun, so if you do have any questions for Dan, you can go ahead and ask that now. Okay, now as we're waiting for the questions, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to inform you that if any of you feel that your team members, colleagues, friends might benefit from this webinar, I'm happy to inform you that this will be available in the recorded format and it can be purchased from our website, or you could also call us at 800-447-9407. Dan, I did not see any questions that's coming up from our participants. Let's give it about another 2 to 3 minutes time and then conclude this session, okay?
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, just also like to inform you that if in case that a question comes up in your mind after this session is over, all that you can do is you can go ahead and send a mail to www.globalcompliancepanel.com. You could send in your questions directly to me, or you could post in your questions on our website. So what we can do is we can go ahead and send an email to our presenter and can get that answer from you even after this session is over today. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask it to Dan, and he can go ahead and clarify your questions and doubts for you. Okay, Dan, I have a question from one of the participants. I'm going to pass that question over to you through the chat messenger, okay?
Okay.
Great, Dan, I've just sent you so that you could read it out loud and then answer it for the participants.
All right. How do we validate the protection of documents that are manually entered with no calculations? Also, we have a paper copy and an electronic copy. Now, in terms of Excel spreadsheets, in terms of this whole validation business, this is a general rule. It's not written down any place, but everybody that I know of accepts it, that if you're not doing any calculations, there's nothing to validate, because typically what you're trying to do is show that the software operates correctly, and that usually means that it is doing some calculations or doing some interpretation and giving you as a result. So if I understand the first question, how do we validate the protection of documents that are manually entered with no calculations? I don't think there's anything to do. I don't think A20.70i is going to apply. We also have a paper copy and an electronic copy. So you would want to rely upon the paper copy if you had any inspections, and that will get you out of the Part 11 piece. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dan. And I also have another question from one of the participants. I'm just going to send it to you through the chat messenger again.
Okay.
Thank you. There you go.
What is available to make improvements to track changes? I don't know. I used to know. I just don't remember. But I will tell you how to find out. If you go to the Microsoft website and ask about and put into their search engine something about Excel, and then start to look for third-party information, they will actually give you back a list of third-party companies that sell something to fix the track changes problem. And so if you go to their website and you can actually put in Part 11, because that's the solution, that's the problem that they're trying to solve, what you'll get back is 3 or 4 companies that have worked with Microsoft in order to implement the systems. Now, I just don't happen to remember the names of any of them, but that's the easy way to find out. And you'll get somebody that has been that has done some work with Microsoft that you really want. You can also Google this Part 11 and Excel, and you'll find lots of companies that way as well. And there's a bunch of companies out there that do this.
Thank you, Dan. Let's give about an additional time so that we can see whether there's any questions that's coming up. Okay, Dan, I do see that there is a question that is posted in the Q&A panel. Can you see that, Dan?
I don't see any that I haven't answered.
Okay, just give me a minute. Okay, Dan, what I can do is I can just pass on that question to you through the chat messenger.
Here we go. All right, how can you ensure change control on password-protected calculation spreadsheets? How do you know who made the changes? Well, I think there's probably 2 different ways that this thing could go. So when I'm under change control, what I have out there is a spreadsheet that has a version. And so when I talk about change control, I'm really talking about version control as opposed to a particular calculation. And so what I don't want to do is let people get in and make changes to the basic formulas. I only want them to get into the cells that I'm allowing them to get into. And so in the first case, where I have this thing under version control, password protected doesn't make any difference. I know what the version is. and nobody can make any changes in the underlying formulas because they don't know what the password is. And so there, I'm going to treat it just like a document, just like a procedure. The other case is that I might be using it to do a particular set of calculations, and perhaps this is the problem. When I've got this set up and somebody does data entry, it doesn't leave a record behind if every time that I've used it. Track changes isn't going to work as I explained. So there, your only solution is to print out the spreadsheet and make a paper copy, or to get one of these add-in programs, which I answered in another question. So I hope that addresses what the issue is.
Thanks again, Dan. I also have another question that's coming up from a participant. I'm just going to send it to you through the chat messenger.
What is the validation burden on using built-in Excel functions, t-tests, ANOVAs, and stuff like that? Well, there's a bit of an issue here, but what you are validating is not that Excel functions correctly. In other words, your validation does not have to prove that it understands how to do a t-test. All of that stuff is built in. Now, in t-tests and ANOVA, if you are using the built-in, I've lost the phrase here, but there are things that you can turn on in the analysis tool pack. Those are macros, and you're not proving that they work. You're not proving that Excel knows how to add 2 and 2 and get 4. What you're proving is that the formulas that you're entering are entering correctly. Now, there is a question about whether or not you get, if you're on a network, whether or not you get Excel installed correctly. And so sometimes you see people wanting to validate its installation, but you're validating the calculations that you've written into it, not the calculations that came with it from the factory. So you have no validation burden for all the built-in functions.
Thank you, Dan. And ladies and gentlemen, we have ran out of time. And if in case if you still have any questions that needs to be cleared from Dan, as I mentioned to you earlier, you can probably go ahead and send it to me through chat after the session is over, or you could also go ahead and email me so that I can go ahead and send that questions back to our presenter to answer those for you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful to all of you having taken part in this webinar. And as I mentioned, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can send us an email at webinars@globalcompliancepanel.com. Now, we welcome your suggestions and feedback and how we can improve our webinars. And we look forward to having you with us again. And Dan, before we could conclude, do you have any thoughts before we end the session for today?
Well, again, it's make sure that you understand where all of your Excel spreadsheets are being used. And then make sure that they're all validated. There are two issues. You want to make sure that they are operating correctly. That's your primary function of validation. But secondly, you want to protect yourself against an FDA inspection. And so that means that you need to know where they all are. And I've given you two techniques. Watch for their references in procedures, particularly in the approval of procedures, and include searching for them in internal quality audits, and then validate all the ones that you find. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And well, thanks, ladies and gentlemen. And we look forward to having you with us again sometime soon. And on behalf of our presenter, Dan, and the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to say thank you for participating in this webinar, and I wish you a pleasant day ahead. Thank you, and thank you, Dan. Thanks a lot for your time today, and you have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.